Hello and welcome to Fireside Chats with me, Dr. Peters. I was born and raised in New Hampshire, and I completed my PhD at the University of Glasgow. My research looks at the intellectual history of the U.S. Constitution and how that history, philosophy, political theory, and constitutional law can help us better understand and address contemporary social and political issues. Now, today, what I'd like to chat about is voting rights, election legitimacy, and with it, democracy. As we discussed in the first video of this series, part of what we the people means is that we get to decide. And a crucial part of that is through voting. This is kind of the basis for having a voice in deciding on who we are as a people and how we want to govern ourselves. Those two major questions that we keep coming back to. Now, I want to discuss this in terms of last week's video about the epistemological breach underlying political polarization in the United States right now, and that idea of tribal epistemology that we discussed at the end of the video. Now, I'll include links to both of those at the bottom. But what brings up this topic is the SAVE Act, which works to secure elections through voter identification laws and regulations. Now, experts have largely illustrated that these mainly just inhibit people from voting. Now, this isn't the only issue that raises this question. In the past decade, we have seen over and over again groups and their leaders questioning the legitimacy of elections, saying that elections were stolen. So these raise the idea of the legitimacy of our elections and also the very idea of democracy and liberty, an idea that people, not only in the United States, but around the world, are becoming more and more disenchanted with and questioning whether it's worth even keeping around because it doesn't seem to be working. Now, to understand and unpack these questions, ideas, and these events, as well as potentially talk about some ways that we can address them, we're going to look at James Wilson's theory, which should come as no surprise to regular viewers of this channel. As I mentioned and we discussed in the first video of this channel, we the people means we get to decide, and we get to decide through voting. This was pretty standard among the founders. Now, there was some differentiation on how much democratic input there should be in the federal government, but generally, everybody should get to vote. And as we talked about in the 18th century, everybody didn't actually mean everybody. It meant mainly people who looked like me. However, as I argue in that video, one of the duties or responsibilities that the founders left us is to actually make good on that promise and ideal of liberty and justice for all, as we have at the end of the Pledge of Allegiance, the idea of liberty found in the Declaration of Independence and in the preamble of the U.S. Constitution, that everyone really should get a say and how we're governed. Now, among the founders, Wilson was really out in front. He was the first one to articulate and champion the idea of one man, one vote, that everybody gets an equal voice. And he reiterated this over and over again in the Constitutional Convention. He didn't always win those debates, but he stood by that principle. One of the reasons why Wilson might have been so keen on this was he was an immigrant. He didn't arrive in the United States until 1765. He was in his 20s, he had been educated back in Scotland, and he jumped right into the patriot cause. He wrote pamphlets, and he would later sign the Declaration of Independence, be part of the Constitutional Convention, and later be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. He was involved. But at the Constitutional Convention, there seemed to be this concern that only native-born Americans should be trusted to hold political office, or at least they should have lived in the United States for a ridiculous number of years. Now, on these points, Wilson nicely pointed out that under these regulations, he couldn't hold many of the offices that he was helping to shape and draft in that convention. This gave the other members of the convention pause, and they later changed and reduced the amount of time that was required to be eligible for certain offices. Similarly, when it came to admitting new territories into the Union, some members of the convention wanted to treat these new territories as colonies, just as Great Britain had done to them. And again, Wilson pointed out that if the original 13 colonies treated these new territories as lesser partners, as colonies, without the same level of representation, that they would likely get the same results: a revolution and independence. To make all of this work, Wilson recognized that we all had to have an equal voice in how we govern ourselves. Now, Wilson also recognized the potential for and danger of political polarization. Now, he wouldn't use that term because he was living in the 18th century and the term hadn't been invented yet. But he describes it through his understanding of what Reid calls a benevolent affection, and particularly the one that Reid describes as the public spirit. Now, Wilson chooses to label it as the esprit du corps, if I'm getting my French pronunciation right. But I'm going to stick with Reid's public spirit for everyone's sake. Now, what this public spirit is that natural affection we have for our own community or tribe. It's what bonds us together as human beings to form societies. Now, both recognize that not only is this necessary for the formation of society, but it's also potentially dangerous. That this affection, if misguided or manipulated, could be inflamed to start fights between groups or wars between nations, something that we can see across the historical record. Wilson also saw the potential for someone either in power or seeking power to manipulate this natural affection by narrowing it artificially, to say only this group is part of our community. And what that does is, by forming an in-group, they can then rile up their base against this out-group that has now been formed. They can then ride that wave and gain power as being the leader of this in-group. Now, this sounds a little bit like the tribal epistemology we discussed last week. However, the tribal epistemology takes this to another level altogether. The in and out groups are not just determined by geographical location. It also doesn't necessarily include race or the color of one's skin, which is one of the oldest ways that an in and an out group have been created in the United States, and one of the most brutal. Tribal epistemology quintessentially rests on belief. Believing the right things allows you to identify with the in-group, and you believe those things because you're part of the in-group, and then announce them to the world to prove that you're part of the in-group. It's all about belief and belonging. Now, this particularly makes it even easier to manipulate than Wilson foresaw, because if belief is the part that defines you as part of the group, a leader can change what the group is supposed to believe in, and the group will follow in order to continue to belong to that group. So it's very difficult to argue somebody out of this position with evidence, because the belief is not based on evidence. It's based on identity and belonging. This makes the polarization even more dangerous and more severe and more difficult to deal with, as we discussed last week. So with that, what does this mean for elections and assertions that the election has been stolen, or that we need to have more regulations and security around voting because the wrong people are voting? People are voting twice. Dead people are coming to vote. What do we do, and how do we understand these accusations and ideas? Well, within this tribal epistemology, those accusations sound very logical and persuasive. If you have defined a set of ideas and a group, particularly your political opposition and their political positions, as quintessentially un-American, as foreign propaganda, a foreign invasion, and enemies of the state, if one of those candidates or policies win in an election, by definition, there must be something wrong with the election. Because how can somebody who's by definition un-American, now the leader of the United States, or a policy that we see as, again, quintessentially un-American, how could that pass the American public if, again, it's un-American? There must be something going on. There must be somebody rigging the election, or un-American people are voting. So the natural solution is something like the SAVE Act. voter ID laws to make sure that only real Americans are voting. Now, by definition, we're talking about citizenship, but how these laws are shaped, it normally differentiates along the lines of that in and out group. Now, I don't think many normal Americans, us common folk, would explicitly try to disenfranchise, to remove the right to vote from some of our fellow citizens. However, when they see the example of the kinds of people who are losing the right to vote, they're not terribly concerned because they're not real Americans. They're not part of their in-group. It's not great, but it's acceptable collateral damage. And we can see this historically in the claims of how people argue against the results of certain elections. For instance, President Obama and the birther movement are a prime example of this. People demanded to see Obama's birth certificate because they couldn't believe that he was really an American. They believed he must have been born somewhere else and therefore was disqualified from holding the office. Now, why was he really un-American? Well, he was black, let's be honest. He also ran on progressive ideas. He was running on foreign propaganda. Now, he arguably didn't follow through on that progressive campaign, but that's a video for another day. And we can also see this in the claims that Obama was a secret Muslim at the time when the Islamic community was the newest foreign enemy of the United States, the newest group that was deemed as un-American. So we can see that at the heart of these arguments is the idea that Obama was inherently disqualified from holding the position of President of the United States because he was quintessentially un-American and an enemy of the state by definition, at least within this tribal epistemology in the most extreme ends of it. Now, we can also see this with Biden, who didn't have any of the quote-unquote classical markers to other him as part of the outgroup. And yet, the claim was still put forward that the election must have been stolen. And there was court case after court case that illustrated that there was absolutely no evidence for this claim. And yet, people mounted an insurrection on January 6th to try to take back their democracy, right? They felt that the United States was under attack. It was experiencing a foreign invasion, and they were goaded on by their leader and media aligned with him that said that this was true, that it was a foreign invasion of immigrants who were voting, and the DNC that was quintessentially un-American had rigged the election. So again, we see that Biden, by definition, should not have won the election because he represents a quintessentially un-American ideology and is part of the un-American opposition party. Now, in political theory and political science, we would call this effective political polarization. And that means when you no longer just disagree with the other side about ideas and how you want to move forward, but you see them as an enemy, as the opposition, as an existential threat to your country and its future. Now, this poses a very real threat to our democratic governance as such, our democratic systems and norms. However, there's another layer that threatens democracy as an idea or an ideal. Should we continue to pursue the ideal of democracy, or should we just give it up because it doesn't seem to be working? Now, people within this tribal epistemology that saw President Obama and President Biden as quintessentially un-American and thus disqualified from holding the office, they see this as the election's not working. However, many Americans on the fence, on the left and right, have been disenchanted with the results of elections for likely decades now. They keep electing people hoping for a change, hoping for their grievances to be addressed and their needs to be met. And they haven't been. Instead, there's continuous infighting in Congress, there's gridlock, nothing gets passed, and everything gets opposed simply because it's put forward by the other team. I think one of the best examples of this is if you poll the American people and you ask them about their feelings about Obamacare, you'll see a partisan split. But if you ask them about the ACA or the Affordable Care Act, the proper name for Obamacare, you see a high percentage of Americans that agree that they really like this program, or at least they don't want to lose it because it's the best they've had so far. That causes gridlock. It makes democracy no longer work. And when democracy doesn't work, when we no longer trust our elections, we no longer see our democratic government as legitimate and question the very conception of democracy, it leads people to think maybe we do need a dictator for a day to start to sort things out. Now, I prefer the solution that is suggested by Wilson's theory that we should double down on democracy as education, and an education in patriotism and community and compassion, believe it or not. Now, Wilson's solution in his theory is not so much a solution to an existing problem of political polarization, but a kind of vaccine or inoculation to prevent this narrowing of the public spirit into tribes, and what we have today, tribal epistemology. Wilson thought it was incumbent upon nations to educate their citizens to be able to differentiate between real, true patriotism and what he calls its fake friends. Now, real patriotism is a love for country, but not one that ignores the faults, failings, and places where improvements can be made in the country. Real patriotism recognizes these failures and where there's room for improvement and actively engages with trying to address those things. Alternatively, its fake friends might include nationalism or particularly ethno-nationalism that demands loyalty and respect for the nation and the leaders no matter what they do, not just despite their faults and failings, but potentially because of them. That's not patriotism, that's blind obedience. It's certainly not liberty. Now, what I think is even more helpful is Wilson thought that nations should also try to encourage the development of what he called moral abstraction. Now, he defined this term through a constellation of terms, such as patriotism, a passion for the common weal, or what we might call today a devotion to the common good. Essentially, what moral abstraction is extending that public spirit to an ever greater group of people, your local community, your state, your region, your nation, and even humanity as a whole. Wilson's ideal was that we would become citizens of the world. Yes, an American founder thought that was the ideal that we should look to achieve through the U.S. Constitution and democratic governance. Now, he thought nations could do this through an example both in their constitutions and the laws they passed. Wilson, particularly when it came to moral abstraction, believed that voting was a major avenue for educating the people and how to expand this public spirit to a greater and greater group of people. How this worked was Wilson believed that when people started voting for national representatives and on national issues, they would inform themselves about these other communities and these other places in the nation. And they would have to extend compassion to them and figure out how they could help address those problems. This would create a sense of community that we are all Americans. Our public spirit would thus extend to them, and with it, a drive to realize the common good for that entire group through empathy and compassion. Now, we can see that voting alone didn't quite realize that ideal that Wilson had hoped for. However, my suggestion, which in part is informed by one of my brilliant former students, is that the key is how we approach voting and democratic governance. If we approach it with the ideal of the common good, of having compassion and empathy for the other people within our own country and those further afield, other countries, that we will actually start to develop this moral abstraction. We will start to see more and more portions of humanity as part of our community, and thus will extend this natural affection, the public spirit, to them. Now, that might sound a wee bit idealistic, but identity and intention are what motivate and drive collaborative action and change, at least according to Hannah Arendt, as we discussed in multiple other videos. And so this idea again rests on the question of who do we want to be as a people and how do we want to govern ourselves in accordance with that? Because what I'm arguing is to start to heal this epistemological breach, to restore trust within institutions that normally deliver trustworthy and verifiable information, and to restore a trust in our government. We have to first restore a trust amongst ourselves. We have to heal our society and our community. We have to change our culture. And that change in our culture about how we see each other, how we engage with information, and how we engage with the democratic process will be the potential key to making our democratic government work for us, we the people again, to restore it and make it work better than it had before. So again, the question is up to us. What kind of a people do we want to be, and how do we want to govern ourselves? Do we want to do the hard work of advanced citizenship that democracy requires to intentionally work to extend compassion and empathy to a greater and greater part of the population, to see more and more people as part of our community? Or do we prefer the red team and the blue team? Do we prefer our tribes? And with it, rather blind obedience. The decision's up to us. That's still what we the people means. And while my solution might seem idealistic, changing our culture, changing our society is well within our power, within we the people's power, because we're what forms culture and society. And if we decide to change how we interact and what we value within society and within that culture, it will have a revolutionary impact on how we govern ourselves and how our government relates to us and operates. And for now, I'll leave you to ponder that. I hope you found it interesting and informative. At the very least, I hope it helped you understand some of the arguments around elections, their legitimacy, and why so many people are feeling disenchanted with democracy. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them below. And if you found this interesting and would like to hear more on similar topics, feel free to subscribe to my channel. I put out a new essay and video every Friday on subjects such as these. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.